You're listening to Extra Textual. This is a show where we talk about an idea, concept, theme, trend, and relate it to some kind of media like film, TV, video games, books, music, and hopefully discover something about ourselves or our culture along the way. Thanks for listening. Okay, welcome to the show. This is Eli Steenledge, and with me as always is
Jeremy Holiday.
And this is our year-end sort of wrap-up show where we kind of discuss the last year, in this case 2018. We usually come to it a little bit later because we are not professional critics or do this for a living. So we're catching up as much as we can. My kind of arbitrary deadline is usually like the Oscars, even though I don't really pay much attention to them. It's like the last
it makes sense.
Thing that
other people are talking about things they like
from the last year. Yeah. But we do have a special guest with us tonight who is a film critic for Consequence of Sound. How are you doing tonight, Blake Goble?
Great. Really happy to be here, guys. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I just want to say I was listening to the last couple episodes of Extra Textual, and it's like, oh my God, they got a soundboard. I hope I get to hear it in my episode. And no, but seriously, I really appreciate what you guys do. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I like that you're kind of like a pro art deconstruction and dissemination podcast, but enough flattery. Really, I'm just happy to be here and happy to share some thoughts, insights, and analysis and ornery comments about the movies of 2018.
Yeah. Blake is the senior staff writer at Consequence of Sound, writing about film. And I wish we normally don't record through the computer directly, so we don't have the soundboard. Otherwise, I would have given like your name and title like some nice reverb. Yeah. But we'll try it. Maybe like in post production, I can do.
Yeah, we can fix that in post.
Yeah,
I'd love some air horns. That's all I ask. Yes.
Great. Yeah.
We got to make one of those auto-tune things, I think.
Yeah.
Need some auto-tune.
You can do some
absolutely.
samples on this soundboard, can't you, Jeremy?
Yeah, you can do one sample.
One sample. Okay, we'll work on that. So we're talking about, like I said, kind of the year in film total. And here at Extra Textual, we don't really do like a straight rundown of our sort of top 10 or top 20 or whatever it is, even though some of us do kind of make those lists in some ways.
Some of us do that.
Not Jeremy.
Not me.
So he doesn't believe in lists. We'll just say that.
Oh, that's totally not true, but I don't make a list of movies.
So we do kind of try to make some connections between some of our tastes and just films that might make interesting conversations between all of us. So we'll kind of look at that, and we'll also kind of connect them through some different themes that we can pull out from the year, as we usually like to do something with themes. But first I want to just kind of mention a little bit, like, these lists are a little bit arbitrary, very subjective. I think a lot of critics talk about that. It's very easy to say, like, how could you not put this film on your list, or how could you put that on your list? That movie is horrible. So it is sort of subjective at the end of the day, but we can have some great conversations. I want to kind of hear how you guys kind of pick out what you sticks with you for the year. But I think for me, like, it is a lot about like surprise, what surprised me, what sort of moved me or thrilled me. And by surprise, I mean, it could be like a camera move that's like a little thing in a film that really surprised me. I'll talk more about that maybe in something like First Reformed, where it sort of breaks out of its mold and really was one of the big surprises of the year for me. But it could be also just like larger things too, that like a whole film that really took me on an emotional journey or connected me with me in a certain way. And that's kind of why I say it can be subjective, because those things can hit us in different ways. But what do you guys sort of think about when you're reflecting on sort of what stood out to you in the year?
Well, I mean, just looking at like the films that I saw and that I liked this year, I found that like I was interested in films about small things. Won't You Be My Neighbor, Leave No Trace. This film I saw at the film festival called American Animals, which is like a documentary about a real small-time college heist. For those who listen to the show, like, you've probably heard me talk about how much I hate Infinity War, and some of the other big stories of this year. But I thought that there was a lot of, especially in Won't You Be My Neighbor. I mean, there was just like by the end of the film where they break out of that space and talk a little bit about the modern social media world for a tiny bit. It felt so quaint. But there was a way in which it seemed like if there's a cyclicality to the intensity of addressing your audience, that it was clearly moving in the other direction, where like it's not bigger and better and faster and oh my effing G is kind of like
to blow you away. Yeah.
Let's just tell a little story about a guy, and certainly like there's a lot of ways in which like Fred Rogers' life and his work, are embodied in the way that film was presented. But I just felt like the films that I liked most this year weren't ones that were like begging for my attention. They were presenting me with some information at a pace which I found comfortable and let me enjoy it. Like Leave No Trace, like the pacing of Leave No Trace. Like what really happens? I mean, there's not this like central conflict and resolution that you can track. I mean, it's like some stuff happens, there's some tension, it's gone, and then the end of the film, like the tension has been gone for a while, and a lot of the end of it, so the epilogue. So, I mean, those are the things that I found, the things that I picked.
Except maybe Into the Spider-Verse, which is really in your
face.
But
here's the thing, Into the Spider-Verse is fabulous. But I also felt like it was we've had there's if you want to listen to an episode where I gush about it, listen to one of our episodes. But I also feel like it's one of the few films, kind of like Moulin Rouge, that like takes the fact seriously that like you can do anything on the screen, you can say anything, you can like totally assault your audience with thing after thing after thing after thing, and each one thing is better than the next. I mean, it's the only it's sort of like an assault on your a sense of what's going to happen in expectations, and it's like you can't do that in half measure. Yeah, and I think like so. I guess there are those contrasts. In some sense, like Incredibles 2. Big, lots of stuff, and they do it well. And also to contrast that, something that quiet and well paced and interesting, and about really low stakes that are important, which are very human.
Yeah. What about you, Blake?
So, a couple different contributing factors. So at a front-loading level, I don't know if I'm pulling the curtain back a little too much on the process here. As a voting member of the Chicago Film Critics Association, one of the perks and curses is the studios and public relations companies, bless them, send you just truckloads of screeners, links, hard disks, and all of a sudden between mid-November and mid-December, the voting and screening period, I find myself in just like a deluge of content, as it were. All of a sudden, I'm kind of like avoidant of summer spectacle. To your point, Jeremy, Infinity War. Can I cuss on this podcast?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was way too old for that shit. It was like
God.
It was just, to your point, I kind of like something. I like stuff that's a little intimate. I like stuff that's emotional. I like stuff that's kind of personal. I like stuff that's political, that's relevant, that's racial,
and not stupid.
No, to be fair, I like stupid in some if it's done well.
Yeah, I mean that's totally a great response. That's fair.
Like Mandy is arguably very stupid at points, and that's what I dig about it. Grind metalcore nonsense, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, and I'll break this down thematically in a second. But the first and foremost standard I have is, it's Saturday. I've rushed through 3 to 5 movies with as much time as I can. What are the ones that stuck? What is staying with me 24 hours later? What's with me 2 days later? What's with me 10 days later? And memorability, short term, long term, it's a very important grading standard for me. And I get it. These lists are usually kind of number fluid. I presented to you guys a movie list that I created of my top, or ranking every movie I've seen this year. Yep. I know for a fact that I'm going to be down on Bohemian Rhapsody for a long time. I know I'm going to be extremely high on BlacKkKlansman for a long time. But there are some movies that kind of like shift and adjust. I really like Can You Ever Forgive Me, but it kind of warmed its way up to me in the sense that it was a film about artistic process in a very sincere and mundane and adult way. Death of Stalin I thought was really funny, and it kind of grew on me because I thought it was such a creative approach. And If Beale Street Could Talk, I thought was a little too airy at first, but then all of a sudden the artistry and imagery just kind of emblazons itself in the back of my mind in a way that I just can't ignore. And then, I go back to movie. I change my list for here and there because it's a fun board hobby. We also hype it up. We have to do our top fives. But the interesting thing is, as I'm looking back in 2018, the movies that are of interest to me kind of had to deal with a couple core themes, like living in America, not to be James Brown here, but Black Klansman, If Beale Street Could Talk, Sorry to Bother You, Vice, America to Me, Leave No Trace, Monrovia, Indiana by Frederick Wiseman, or even Private Life by Tamara Jenkins, and Widows by Steve McQueen, Eighth Grade. Sorry, I'm just rambling. But these are all movies that are kind of about like very individualized American experiences and kind of like what it's like to scrape by in America or just kind of figure yourself out in modern America. Other stories I kind of did like this year was stuff of political savagery, Black Klansman, Death of Stalin, Vice. I even like stuff about artistic process, creation, and inspiration. Can You Ever Forgive Me? Other Side of the Wind, which was the miracle that happened. Yeah. Let the Sunshine In by Claire Denis. Even Never Look Away, the Von Donnersmarck film. Just stuff about creation and kind of creativity and inspiration were films that I found generally quite, fascinating. But then, of course, as we kind of discussed before, there's also just the well-done genre film that sneaks up on me, like Hereditary or Mandy, where it subverts expectations, or even Paddington, the children's film done faultlessly.
Yeah.
Or Zama is technically a genre film in that it's kind of like the stoic heroic movie deconstructed through the eyes of a total shitbird on an island, but we could talk about that later too. And just stories about non-whiteness. I make this joke every time this time of year comes around. Sundance, it's the perennial film festival about, what it's like to just be kind of middle class and white in America. And I grow a little tired of it, and I find myself attracted to stories about non-white audiences, non-American audiences as well. And it needs to be something kind of deeply flawed or compelling in the American character, what's wrong with it, or it just needs to be something about perspective outside of this country that kind of interests me. And mind you, this is me putting buzzwords on like a list of 70 movies I've seen over the last year, and only about 20 of them are going to stick in my subconscious, maybe 10 if I'm lucky, and don't go frail 10 minutes. Yeah. So it's a blend, but the more I think about it, the more it's like, maybe the modern America, I can't help but think in radical, like, man, Vice just really kind of cuts to the core of American amnesia. Or If Beale Street Could Talk really speaks to the struggle of being non-white still to this day through its 1970s lens and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I kind of tapped into some of the similar themes that you were talking about that might kind of guide our conversation. I think definitely sort of the diversity in the films this year that I really enjoyed, or kind of basically like non-white guy stories. Because I think we do see more from women this year, but also people of different ethnicities, and also kind of like a subcategory of that is these people sort of on the fringes. I think that you guys both have sort of mentioned, and also like the political side of stuff. I think the response we're getting, and at least for probably the three of us, I think some of this, and the people making the films, is sort of a response to our current sort of national condition right now with the presidency and stuff. And
that was so subtle that I almost didn't stress out.
I know you didn't quite get that. Yeah. That it is sort of like, what are we kind of looking at that's being affected by our national condition, and not who is kind of being talked about in our government right now, but looking at these other side characters and kind of bringing out their stories a lot more. So kind of what things we've mentioned: Black Klansman, If Beale Street Could Talk, Sorry to Bother You, Widows. I don't know if we'll get into it too much, but I think The Hate You Give is actually a pretty good film for kind of being aimed at teenagers.
That was great, yeah.
Black Panther, Roma, Blind Spotting. And then sort of the people at the fringes, Leave No Trace, which I think we'll dig into. First Reformed, even Mandy, I think, is really about people sort of trying to live their own life the way they want and sort of disrupted by that. And then You Were Never Really Here, even I Love Dogs, I think, has maybe a lot more political connection than it was intended at first. So I think those are kind of a breakdown of where we kind of want to dive into a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Leave No Trace, because that's one I know we've all three seen and can think about a little bit more, and is definitely kind of goes against the grain of mainstream in a lot of ways, even though it's not weird at all. But I think for me, it's a very like quiet film in a lot of ways. What struck me is there's no really like antagonists in the film. Everybody is trying to help them, even though like the father figure played by Ben Foster is dealing with a lot of like trauma and hard things. A lot of it is sort of like subtext, and everybody like generally tries to help him. There's one moment in the film later, and by the way, Blake, if we didn't say this, and our listeners, we pretty much don't worry about spoilers on this show. Oh, yeah. So we're gonna assume we just want to like dig into things, so we're gonna talk about it.
Yeah. Man, I can't believe they left all those traces, despite what the title said. Yes.
I know.
All those traces.
All the traces. Yeah.
No.
But when he falls in the forest, and I thought it was like, oh, is this the movie? He's dead. The father dies. This is not the movie I thought we were watching. And then I was like, oh, he's not. Okay. And he's gonna get better, and people helped him. Yeah. And that really kind of sealed the sort of tone of the film. And then I could be like, okay, I'm gonna kind of like ease into this and rest in this story and be like, this is what we're watching now. So I think it was, really compassionate filmmaking, dealing with these characters and just kind of letting them be observed. I heard that once Ben Foster signed on, Deborah Granick, the director, and him just like went through and took out like 40% of the dialogue in the film just to kind of let it like rest more and not have so much exposition explaining everything, which I think was really interesting.
And I don't know, because I don't know about this stuff, but I can, based on that fact, I could say that if I imagine that film with that exposition in it, it's not nearly as good. I think
not as interesting.
A lot of the power of the film is that I think when people do talk, they have really interesting things to say. To echo your point about like the part at the beginning when sort of the dad doesn't die. To just be crass and to the point. The emotional stakes of the film are real, so I give a shit about these people.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, like his dad is. Because it's like it's not true in the real world that every time someone gets injured, they die.
Right.
Right. It's also not true that every dad who has his daughter out in the wilderness is really weird and sexually molests her or something.
Right.
Has some sort of dark family secret. Maybe it's just what it is. So I really appreciated that. I also, I have a lot of friends who are vets, and in talking with them, a lot of times, like, there's a lot of times why people will hang out with other people who had that experience. Is like you just can't really explain it to other people why you can't quite fit in again.
And they don't
somewhere.
try very hard in the film to explain it.
No,
they just show it.
Yeah.
And
And I just was like a sucker for like that part at the end when she's holding the beehives and and the warmth of community is important to her, but it's it's different for her father.
Yeah.
I just as I zoom out and make crazy claims about the information age, I think like in the information age, there's so much profound truth that we encounter in the world. We just consider it so cliche. But it's, if I think about the things that honestly affect and move me in my life, I learned them from rock songs and movies and a lot of other places.
Yeah.
But they're, important and powerful. And I think that there's the movie, because its tone and pacing take itself seriously, it doesn't have to say big, grand, florid things to be emotionally powerful.
Yeah.
I was going to say there is a sensitivity and patience to it, and I don't want to entirely say Deborah Granick or Ben Foster one way or the other. The approach that they all agreed upon is really kind of cool, and I love that you're suggesting like yeah, they stripped X amount of dialogue. And I think to myself, in the hands of a more feeble director, this movie is 5 minutes away from Ben Foster giving like a big expository speech about like why he's troubled, or the daughter trying to explain or examine her feelings.
Yeah.
Right.
And I put this question out on Twitter around the time of release. When was the last time you saw a movie that dealt with poverty or homelessness that didn't kind of like do the befallen genius cliche, like the soloist and Jamie Foxx living underneath LA bridges, or didn't kind of rely on like hobo jokes and stuff like that? That was just that a movie that just kind of gets to be.
Yeah.
And Deborah Granick, based on, I've only seen this and Winter's Bone from her, but from what I see from her is a person who has a very patient, considered eye, and whereas Winter's Bone is very directly a send up of like westerns and its kind of modern muted choices.
Yeah.
It's almost like a revenge thriller in a minor key. This is almost like a Robert Altman film with an even more muted key, in that it's just purely observational and incidental. And yeah, as a result, like that relationship, the sincerity of that relationship kind of gets to blossom in a way that's actually quite affecting. And to my earlier point about memorability, it's like, gosh, not a whole lot happens if you think about the movie, because it's their sojourn to survive, not in sensationalist terms, but in basic terms. But there's something very affecting about that close-knit bond. And there is also something very like, this is what it's like to live in America right now. Our veterans are kind of struggling on the back end. Some people just kind of don't know how to come back inside when they've been evicted from their homes. And I know I'm speaking kind of in culture cliches and tropes, but there is something very truthful to this observation that feels like this could be anybody, 3 people removed from people like watching, what is it? Minding the Gap, the Rockford documentary from Hulu. That's ostensibly about young kids that are kind of lost at a generational like crossroads, and they wind up moving all over the country just to kind of find work. I feel like spiritually, Leave No Trace and Minding the Gap could kind of hang out with each other in that sense. Same with Monrovia, Indiana, the Wiseman movie, where it's basically like a small town America clinging to life, even though it's kind of falling behind with kind of the growing divide in this country. But Leave No Trace, as a narrative form, or as a narrative take on this, was very, very compelling, because it's true, or at least it feels true,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know about this aspect for sure, but I feel like some of the people they encounter, maybe in these smaller communities, were not actors. And in general, it feels sort of improvisational in the acting style. And kind of what you're getting at too, both of you, kind of this undercurrent of like dissatisfaction with our country and the way it works. I feel like we kind of get these little treasures of movies the last couple of years, at least one. It kind of has like a kinship with Florida Project and American Honey, and even going back to like Beasts of the Southern Wild, where like we get these aspects of our nation that you don't normally see, or are sort of ignored, these people. But I think it brings up something that these people don't feel comfortable in the sort of system the way it is. And eventually I think we're sort of have to deal with that. And maybe it's growing in certain populations. So I'm really glad that people are willing to tell these stories and in such a insightful way. People do, and I think that kind of fits in with that. Leave No Trace.
Yeah.
Let's move on and talk about some other things. Let's move to If Beale Street Could Talk, because this is one that I was really excited to see, and took a while to kind of get around to our neck of the woods a little bit later. And I have to say that I am totally on Team Barry Jenkins after this and Moonlight. And I know he did some TV work. Jeremy and I have talked about the Netflix show, which I'm blanking on right now.
Dear White
People. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did an episode for that.
Episode, yeah.
The single best episode of Dear White
really
People.
good episode.
And I would say with Reggie and the Barney.
Yeah. And I know it's pretty well talked about now, but I feel like I did notice this, and it was right before I heard a podcast interview with Barry Jenkins. But in just watching the trailer for If Beale Street Could Talk, I was like, he is conjuring Wong Kar-wai with what he's doing. And I think it's not stealing, but I was like, he is the next Wong Kar-wai. And then I heard an interview, and they were asking some of his favorite films, and he was like, you know, In the Mood for Love, he's like, that's just one of the best. And he's like, if I could do something like that, if I can evoke anything like that. Yeah.
Just a quick, do you ever see the Criterion Collection video where Barry's invited into the Criterion closet and he just starts like grabbing every last thing he can, being like, "Oh my God, Cassavetes, Wong Kar-wai," like all these people. It's super endearing because clearly he's a lifelong student, which is something I appreciate. I love that you're bringing that up because he totally wears his references on his sleeve. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I was just like, so taken with sort of the poetry of this film, even though it deals with some really hard subjects. And I think it's almost that sort of contrast with how sort of lovely the costuming and the camera work and especially the music. I think the music is a big part of this film, which is probably my favorite score of the year. But the way those things come together is sort of intoxicating. And then sort of with these sort of blunt moments of racism coming into it, I think was really great. How do you feel about it, Blake?
Right there with you. And like I said, it took me a moment to warm up to, in the sense that when you're adapting James Baldwin prose, like the phrase "wax poetic" comes to mind. And I mean, he borders on surrealism and arch structuralism with his style. He takes a lot of momentary lapses. He's very generous to Baldwin's prose and narration. But you also feel like Jenkins genuinely cares about kind of conveying the prose with every tool and frame of reference he can think of. When you were mentioning Wong Kar-wai, also don't forget, like, what is it? The photography of Jack Garofalo or Roy Disareva, I want to say that's pronunciation, or even Gordon Parks in general, and kind of capturing 1970s Harlem in terms of its texture, like the architectural repetition, mathematics, hallways, open streets, kind of the beauty and the grime and dirt and brickstone and things like that, to kind of portray the environment that these people live in. There is kind of a beauty in the systemic hopelessness to it, I guess, not to mix my cliches, but Jenkins swings wide. I've been deconstructing this over and over, trying to look at all the different frames of mind for this movie, the moods and expressiveness of it. What it all boils down to is this is a supreme love story about impossible hope, impossible love against all odds, against systemic criminal circumstances that make it impossible for this wonderful young couple. What are their names again? Tish and Fonnie, Kiki Lane and Stephen James, respectively. Like, they're so beautifully naive and hopeful, and they kind of have to be thrown through the grinder of life and all its ills. And I don't know. I kind of held a hanky the whole time, not to sound like my mom, but I'm thinking to myself, this is a relationship that I don't know if it's built to last, but my God, do I want these two kids to make it through and for their child to make it out okay despite all of this, even though you kind of know the amount of pressure that's being put down upon them. And Barry Jenkins uses like every illustrative quality he can think of in terms of film, from a direct eye contact to the camera, sweeping camera movements, colored imagery, highly saturated, colorful imagery, to kind of get at this like poetic verve. It's almost like looking at an Impulse record album cover or something like that. And I love that you mentioned the score too. From that initial trailer and Nicholas Bertel's trumpet swinging over there, I'm like, wow, is he trying to channel Miles right now? Because I appreciate the audaciousness of trying to do that. It's a movie that just goes all out. You kind of see everybody put their heart onto the screen, knowing full well that this is going to be a rough ride, but they're committed to the belief, hope, and faith of young love and things like that. And this is the kind of stuff that normally makes me cringe to say out loud, but it's like, no, this is like one of the most difficult and rewarding love stories of the modern era, at least that I can think of.
Yeah, I mean, if you kind of talk about it, it almost sounds like it shouldn't work, in a lot of ways. And you're right about sort of the Baldwin like prose, like translating that to film. And I realize later, like it's got a lot of the same structure actually, sort of as Moonlight, where it's elliptical in many ways, that we sort of like jump to these different points. And I generally like this, but it's almost like the narrative is based sort of on like memory, because we come back to some of the same moments kind of replayed, as if it's almost like Fonny in prison sort of thinking back on their sort of romance and where that's going. But there's moments where we kind of jump quickly between different times, and then there's other times where we just sort of spend quite a while in like smaller moments, like when they're first going to tell their families about being pregnant, like that scene goes on for quite a while, that we sort of
and
get
they bathe in it.
Yeah.
What could be like the most dangerous moment in a young people's life? The scariest moment is just that, like, you're bathed in love and support and cautious optimism, with full acknowledgement of their naivete. But it's like, wow, that really could have gone way worse, but it went about as well as you could have hoped.
Yeah, until it does go bad. Yeah, with the in-laws. Yeah, and I think even like little moments where after they look at this apartment that they want to get, the sort of loft apartment, and then they're just sort of like walking on the street and sort of beaming from the thought of the sort of freedom that they have of moving there. And it was just so like lovely, kind of gave me chills. But then I was like, I don't, like, even in the moment I was like, I don't know why this is so fascinating to watch them just sort of like walking down the street. But I think it captured that they do have great chemistry. You could see kind of the love between them, and really kind of feel their emotions. And with that score and that camera work was really nice. And I also heard that they really thought about the look a lot, like you were saying, Blake. And they tried to capture sort of street photography from the time, but as if it was sort of exposed freshly, like the film was exposed freshly, instead of the sort of washed out look we're used to from seeing films in that period with all those vibrant colors. And it does
go ahead. Correctly, Laxton, who shot Moonlight, shot this, and if Moonlight was any indicator, the guy has a willingness to play with color that I find so admirable.
Yeah.
This is totally a put down to some, like, whenever I talk to people about cinematography, everybody leans on, well, it's got to have silhouettes like Roger Deakins. I find it more impressive, and don't get me wrong, I think he's the best at silhouettes. I'm a sucker for color rich. I'm a sucker for oversaturated imagery, and I love how you put that, like, old photography re-exposed and found fresh. I think of that red umbrella in the middle of the night down a rainy street, or kind of lens flares, or like, it doesn't look grimy like a 1970s crime film. It looks extremely, extremely rich and almost inviting.
Yeah, I think why it works is that Barry Jenkins is ultimately like professional enough that he is in full control over what he's conveying to the audience, and he's manipulating the audience in the way that he wants, and I think that's a really sign of a great director, to really bring you along on that journey. So I'm excited about what he does next.
Probably a Batman.
Probably, yeah, superhero film. Yeah. No. We can only
something
hope.
Marvel, yeah.
Black Panther 2. Yeah,
I hope he gets good money.
Oh my gosh, Barry Jenkins with Black Panther, man, amazing.
So let's talk a little bit about First Reformed. I know it was a little bit farther down on your list, Blake, but this is one that really surprised me. I think it is sort of Paul Schrader a little bit in his going back to his taxi driver mode, in that sort of type of story. But the difference here is that this is a very sensitive character that we can really identify with, instead of a different, on the fringes in a different way than in Taxi Driver. I think that we can kind of root for and understand the sort of emotions that he's going through with like delving into understanding the environment and what that means for his life. Sort of this existential crisis that he's going through as a priest. I didn't know about this beforehand, but Paul Schrader evidently wrote a book early in his career out of grad school about the sort of transcendental style of filmmakers like Bresson and Ozu. And this is essentially his chance to work within that style, basically. Because definitely, with his last few films in the last few years, he's definitely swung much more the other direction and kind of like thrown everything at the screen that he can.
And Dog Eat Dog with Nick Cage. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so
Just
here,
the ugliest movie. Sorry.
No. I mean, I feel like in some ways, at least he's trying things, but I'm glad that he sort of like was able to understand what he needed to tell this story, and it seems like a very personal story that he's interested in. But for me, it was like he sticks to a very strict rules about the style of the film that he's making. A lot of like lockdown shots that are steady, they don't move, longer takes that just lets you kind of observe what's happening. And then those sort of main two moments where he sort of breaks out of that, I think, do sort of give you that sort of transcendent experience. And then sort of like flip that on its head a little bit too, to make you not sure what you're supposed to think. So I could go more into that, but I kind of want to hear what you guys...
Yeah, I mean, let's see. I guess today I'm playing sort of like the barbarian to you high class folks. I mean, I had as many things go between Eli and I had said, "Hey, have you seen First Reformed?" And I looked it up and I saw the poster and I was like, "That fucking movie?" I was like, I read a little bit about it and I was like, "No, I haven't seen that tense, gripping thriller."
Right.
And he's like, "You would like it." And even though in general when Eli says that, I should watch the movie because I really would like it. But, he's very subtle. He's like, maybe you'd like it.
Might be good.
Anyway, and so I guess I'm kind of hot and cold these days. But, like, from just about, like, the first 3 or 4 seconds into the film, I was just sort of totally hooked. I love Ethan Hawke's character. It's and I love myself some good like philosophy, and there's so much good philosophical positioning in this film, but it's so terse. It doesn't. I mean, there's no pontificating.
Yeah.
Like at best, it's like a sentence or two, and it just. I mean, for me, like it really, I don't know, brought me on a journey where I reconsidered the relationship of humanity, religion, and the environment. And I think, like, because, I mean, if I look at the film, like, the first transcendent experience when they play the Magic Mystery Tour, where I was like, whoa, like, you are motherfucking going for it.
Right, yeah.
And
where'd that come from?
And I'm pretty sure, like, some of the visual references are definitely to Koyaanisqatsi, like, certainly from the cars and the lanes,
I even felt Tarkovsky to a certain extent with those as well. Yeah.
But I think both. I mean, I think that, like, he's, in some sense, like, just taking a little survey of some of the strongest visual arguments about the environment and humanity, and presenting it in like to an audience that he fully expects and motivates to give a shit about it. And I do.
Yeah,
I am totally along for that ride.
And I really like in that moment what I was kind of talking about, like the switch is like I was just sort of like processing what he was doing,
right? Like
switching to that, and then like sort of just like resting and be like, oh, okay, this is what we're looking at. And then it turns like dark, and it's like, oh, he can't, like that character can't stay in that sort of view of the world, and it turns really dark, which I liked. Like,
and I mean, I'm a big fan of Thomas Merton's writing. Like, I'm literally going to his monastery next week for a silent retreat. So, like, any film that throws in some like heavyweight references to Thomas Merton, I'm totally hook, line, and sinker all the way through. I also, I mean, and this is like my favorite kind of like fish out of water film, where like there's someone in the world who they just can't get it.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think we find, and so I was also really happy with Cedric the Entertainer's character.
Yeah.
Because I feel like he's definitely set up to be absurd, and he's not. You know, and like certainly because he is in no, like he says wonderful things.
Yeah,
there's
makes
nothing
sense
about
quite a bit, yeah.
his demeanor that in any way is ridiculous.
It's not making fun of him.
No, not at all, and not even like that kind of church or anything. But I and I assume the rest who are following along in this journey are totally with Ethan Hawke's character in that like he just doesn't fit. No one else quite seems to get it. And one of the things that there's a moment in there that I'm gushing, but that I kind of like the most is there's a point when he's talking about when he tells Mary after Michael is his name has killed himself, he's like, you should hide the laptop and a few other things, and he just throws out like because his cause was just.
Yeah.
And we don't want to hurt the movement because of some stuff. And I was like, did you believe that when we started this film?
Right.
I was like, I think you had a change of heart that we didn't see. And now, wow, like, whoa.
Yeah.
And there's several times in the film too, like there's a break when he tears out pages. You know, and I'm like, we just don't know what happens there?
Yeah.
I was like,
Just
you know,
obsessed with it,
you know, like, and like, as you know, if I snap out of the viewer and go into like, so the filmmaker mode, I'm like, that takes some balls. You know what I mean? Like, you know, you're really gonna, and you know, like, and it works really well. Like, it doesn't seem like, the effect is that I'm more drawn into the story. I am more interested because there are plenty of times, and I complain about it too on this podcast, where some filmmaker like causes an ellipsis to happen over something, and I'm like, that's just because you can't write that, right? That's because
Right.
you don't know
You
how
didn't
to
know
get
what
us
to do
from point A
there,
to point B. And in this case, I'm just like, oh, like, you know, like there's like the place where he tears out the pages. I'm immediately far more interested than I was a second ago. And I do, and again, like I like a good, nice, tight story that doesn't involve floating in space. But if you're gonna have floating in space and wrapping yourself in, you know, barbed wire to be Christ-like, just do it. And the thing is, like, that shot at the end, when he's sitting at his desk, like, and taking off his shirt, and he's getting ready with his vest to go into the thing. There's like it feels like such a subtle and amazing shot at the same time because he's got his service flag up in the corner. They're playing Onward Christian Soldier.
Yeah.
And it was just like it's screaming at me with its meaning, but also like if I were to take out that still and put it on the wall, it just sort of subtly mentions a couple of different things. And I feel like, you know, with these two bold sort of surrealist steps that are taken in the film, that's sort of what made it really stand out.
Yeah.
Like, the story is interesting besides this, and I think Ethan Hawke's character is compelling, but it doesn't, for me, rise to the level of, holy shit.
Yeah.
You know, like, and I tell people, like, you know, you have to see this. And then the third thing that I love, which is, I just love it, is what I like the deception in the movie poster. Because, like, the movie poster shows an exploded church.
Yeah.
So, like, and I, you know, like 45 minutes into the film, he gets an explosive vest, and I'm like, he's gonna blow up that motherfucking church, but he doesn't. Yeah. And I loved it because I was like, oh man, who put that in the poster?
Right.
You know, like who like put a gigantic, super important spoiler in the poster? You know, it's like Luke, like it's like the poster for Empire Strikes Back is Luke, I am your father. You know, you can't do that. So and then when I saw that he didn't do it, or that element doesn't show up in the film, I was like, oh, you know, because in some sense, as I talked about before, it gives us multiple endings to consider, multiple possibilities of the story. Yeah. It also makes me feel manipulated in like a really positive way. Like, here's me like, oh, I'm a viewer, I totally know what's going to happen. Oh my gosh, I got it because I saw the poster. And then I was like, oh, you probably knew that I saw the poster, so you were having a good time. Yeah. The other thing that I'll mention just really quickly, I don't think it was made this year, but I just listened to the podcast S-Town, which is fabulous. But
Shit Town, yeah.
But like in both of these stories, there is an individual who is like deeply troubled by the environment. You know, I mean, like given there isn't mercury poisoning involved in First Reformed, but I don't think that's entirely what John B.'s story is. But there is a way in which, like, I've always wondered, even from when I was a kid, if like when people started talking about the dangers of global warming at that time, climate change as it went on, like, what are, like, is there going to be a film? You know, because people used to talk about, like, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring being this clarion call for a generation of folks.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I've always been fascinated with the ways in which people in the past talk about what the future is going to be like. You know, and I'm, you know, I was always curious how, like, what would it look like in the years leading up to massive change, either on humans' part or the environment's part, due to climate change, and just to see these two really profound stories of individuals, one fictional, one real, deeply moved and motivated almost solely by the effect that humans had on the planet, it sort of stuck out at me, because they're not. There's not. Certainly in First Reformed, and I'll wrap up here because I know I talk a long time. No one really contests the truth of what the people are like. No one really contests that Michael is correct, and even when the priest, I mean, and the priest point to him, which I think is like fabulous, is like he says to him like, the issue isn't that humanity is going to kill itself, which, you know, we've been threatened with this before. The issue is the darkness inside of you, which, you know, which is like it's essentially one or two lines, but it's like one of the more profound things that I've ever heard said about despair of climate change and the environment. Like, sure, that may be true. Humanity may extinguish itself.
Yeah.
But that doesn't have to affect what you as an individual person are doing with your life.
True.
Which is, you know, generally not something I've ever heard in a film before.
Yeah, and that is an interesting connection to the podcast, because I think they were both sort of like characters that sort of like burnt out in the end, in sort of being like isolated for this thing that they saw as being really passionate and people should care about, but they were in positions that they just could not be hurt. Like, they had to do something drastic. And I think they were both, like, in many ways, compassionate characters towards things and people around them, but not in a way that people could, like, notice or recognize either. And, like, that frustration between those two things just sort of destroys them inside.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the despair stuff, though. I'll admit, this is the only movie this year that it actually took me 2 tries to get through.
That's okay.
In all seriousness, I got 20 minutes into the first watch, and once the poor environmentalist kind of starts making his speech about rising oceans, temperatures, climate change, it's like I started to let out sweat like bullets, turned it off, and I was like, what's on Top Chef? Not to say that I'm not courageous or anything, but like, that is this film's most potent quality. Like, there is a sense of nervous urgency, and I mean, it speaks volumes that, like, I'm kind of haunted by Ethan Hawke. Somebody has to do something! Exclamation late in the film, and it's just like that's applicable to so much of modern life. And I guess, really, I like the film for all the same reasons that you guys do. I think that there is something kind of profound to this. I think Paul Schrader using the Ozu style and kind of referencing transcendentalism in this kind of like clean, stately, minimalist, thoughtful style. It's something I really shouldn't take for granted, because it's so hard to find movies like this that have a foresight of thought. Yep. Here's the problem with that style, and this is purely a discussion of aesthetics and personal preference. I think when you have a solemn, direct, ethereal piece like this, when you have something that is very directorly, as I just made up the word for,
that works, yeah.
Like, it's all, you know, people brag that they know that it's Academy ratio. Then suddenly I see memes of this on Twitter and Instagram. I actually saw somebody retell the entire story through 4 stills from The Simpsons, which I thought was actually pretty impressive. Like the Space Wolf and Homer overweight with Marge laying on him and stuff like that, and I was kind of impressed. But I realized this is a movie within the same vein as Paul Thomas Anderson's kind of style and adult subject matter. And I'm not trying to knock Schrader Anderson so much as I'm saying there's something about that this level of overconfidence, as well as that I think lends itself a little too easily to parody,
Yeah.
or ability to kind of like to tune out or not fully take seriously. Like it is so solemn to the point where you can't help but nervously laugh, and that is the only pitfall that I see for what I think is an extremely audacious film.
Hmm.
Um, it's like, remember when Phantom Thread came out, and all of a sudden you have random Phantom Thread comment generators, or maybe I'm just on Twitter for too long. But it's like people eat this kind of stuff up when it's like so sartorial and in your face.
Hmm.
That's why The Shining is such a popular meme, because of all these perfectly squared off images and things like that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it
whether
is very like mannered and
Yes.
persnickety sort of in how it looks and acts. So I think that could definitely be a turnoff to people. Like it sort of is pretentious in the way that it starts, but I think once you go through the whole journey, it becomes very
Yeah.
emotional. Yeah.
And it's not a movie I dislike in any way, so much as
Mhm.
that's something I kind of I just am always suspicious of something that has this much confidence, I guess is what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
And Schrader wrote freaking Cat People, the remake, and Taxi Driver.
Yeah.
That man knows confidence, and that man probably knows cocaine. So
Yeah.
like, but no, it's still great, and so many colleagues are like really shaken up by this movie. So that's something to admire, for better for worse.
I mean the Academy ratio you're talking about. One thing I did notice this year, and I think we're gonna kind of do like a separate segment on television later, Jeremy and I. But talking about, I noticed like a trend this year with First Reformed, Cold War, which I really like for sort of like intentionally black and white, somewhat period films compared with Roma. I much more was attached to Cold War. I don't think there's like a lot of direct comparisons between those two films, but it felt more like an actual auteur working in their element than Roma felt like trying to work in that vein. And that's coming from someone who's like been a long time Alfonso Cuarón since like The Little Princess, which I thought was great. And I always really liked it.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
just seemed like he was trying to be an artsy European film in that. But also the show Homecoming, all three of these kind of use this smaller frame, and I think it all speaks to sort of this constraint in the characters. Like definitely in First Reformed, he becomes more and more sort of like bottled up and has to sort of like let out this anxiety that he has about the world in some way and do something about it, like we talked about. So he's like the corners are really like the sides are coming in on every way on him, sort of to form. And I think it's the same way with like Cold War, which is this kind of devastating romance where these characters are sort of on and off again and can't quite stay together. But it's a love story, but it's the world sort of imposing itself on that story. And then Homecoming, I don't know if anybody else has seen that on Amazon, but it uses this device where it switches between a normal sort of wide frame and then the smaller aspect ratio or Academy ratio to show sort of a character who's sort of like missing out on their full memory. So it sort of like cuts in on the frame because they don't remember everything. And then there's a great moment in the show where they sort of recall this, and then suddenly like the frame like widens, and it sort of jumps back and forth in different periods of time, and it sort of connects those time periods, which I thought was a great use. But it stuck out to me, these different filmmakers using this to stand out these days, and kind of going back to that when we're so used to wide frames on everything.
Yeah.
Cold War felt like it was a framework like a framework of nostalgia or snapshot of the past. The same way that Grand Budapest Hotel kind of starts wide and through
Yeah.
different time periods, closes up the framework. Unlike a Mission Impossible movie where it's just switching from widescreen to IMAX, which drives people crazy.
Yeah.
I personally don't care, but no,
Yeah.
I love when people kind of use this device, and or maybe next year we'll be nominating or ranking our first Instagram ratio movie that's completely vertical and We'll all have to
Probably.
tilt our necks. Yeah, it'll be awful.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to tell people that they should turn their phones sideways to take videos, and a lot
we
of
give this advice a lot.
the young people are like, "Why? Why do you need?"
Oh,
I'm
my
just
goodness.
posting this on social media. So
Don't you need to see my story in vertical? Oh, that's crazy.